Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Well, welcome everyone to Season 2 of Leading for Life Stories and Episode 1 of Season 2, so actually my 23rd episode overall. I thought I'd start a new season since we're in a new year. It's the beginning of 2024. Hard to believe that's already happened. And I thought I'd start with a personal story one, because I haven't done one of those for a little bit. And I think it's probably a good place to start the year with. When I did the last one of these, I was talking about reconnaissance and the fact that I was on 2 Squadron at RAF Larbrook and cutting my teeth really in the reconnaissance role after a chunk of time at Royal Air Force Bruggen on the Jaguar. And I mentioned at the sort of tail end of that episode that I faced something of a fork in the road and a big choice between going and being a weapons instructor and moving from Germany back to UK to go onto a UK Jaguar squadron as a weapons instructor would have been the inevitable consequence of that, or actually going on exchange, which is something the Air Force does quite a lot of. We have quite a lot of exchange tours across all of the aircraft types that we have. Pretty much everybody's got various exchange opportunities, and the Jaguar in its day had plenty. And I was offered a job with the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, flying the Phantom, the RF4E Phantom, which is the reconnaissance version of the F4, based at German Air Force Bremgarten in southwest Germany, at south west a little bit of the city of Freiburg in the Rhine Valley, only about 20 minutes drive from Switzerland and probably about 10 minutes drive from France. In a really lovely part of Germany, tucked down in the Black Forest, or just off the Black Forest, and scenery-wise stunning. An unbelievably pretty place to live. Lots of really chocolate box villages and fantastic locations and mountains to go and enjoy, and obviously all the delights of France and Switzerland on the doorstep as well. So that was the offer. It required somebody who was reconnaissance experienced rather than being Phantom qualified. And there were a number of Jaguar pilots ahead of me who'd done that job, and they'd all enjoyed it. And I ultimately, having looked myself in the mirror and gone, which way shall I go with this, went for the exchange tour option, which was challenging in a whole range of ways, because it was the first 2-seat aeroplane I'd ever flown. And in the fast jet world, I'd obviously flown with 2 people in the aeroplane plenty of times in flying training, and indeed on a 2-seat Jaguar. But the Phantom was designed from the ground up as a 2-seat aeroplane, and it couldn't be operated with a single pilot. And so getting the best out of it required you to work very effectively with the guy in the back, and the Luftwaffe call him a weapon system operator. And that was the first adjustment that was obviously going to be required to go into that role. But there were some other ones. There's some serious personal ones, not least the fact that it was an accompanied role, not something that really exists in the same way these days. But it required me to go with my wife. If she wasn't going to go, then I wouldn't have got the job. And of course, she was in the Air Force. So that was the first major breakpoint was, well, okay, what are we going to do about this? And she decided that, okay, she would fancy this and should go with me, and she had to leave the Air Force, and basically well ahead of the time she would have actually left. She voluntarily retired, and that had some financial implications that, much to my frustration, the Air Force didn't just compensate for. They just said, right, that's tough. You just got to get on with it. And we also had to go and learn German, because obviously it was on a German squadron, on a German base, and most importantly, it was actually living in a German village, in a bit of Germany where actually an awful lot of the locals do not speak English. They, tucked down in that little southwestern corner, they have very much their own dialect, but also a lot of them speak French because they live right on the French border. And English was something that was not in regular use at all. So learning to speak German was a plus, but also a challenge in that, it took a fair bit of time. It's not something I have necessarily a huge amount of natural aptitude for. But a 6-month language course that luckily I was able to get my wife onto the same course. And so we went off and spent basically our working day, 9 to 4, essentially every day, learning to speak German to a very good standard. I mean, by the end of the 6 months, we essentially had what I'd describe as the grammatical tool set to be able to do pretty much anything with the language. And then really the challenge beyond that was learning more vocabulary and obviously some of the kind of local idiom and just getting more comfortable in the language itself, which inevitably, when you're living, breathing it on a daily basis, was something that happened relatively quickly, although I'll probably come back to that. Learning to fly the Phantom was obviously another thing that was in the in the requirements list here, and there were 2 stages to that. There was a UK bit, because obviously there was recognition that I'd never flown 2C, I'd never flown the F4, which was a completely different aeroplane to the Jaguar, much more powerful in terms of engines, has quite a lot of interesting handling characteristics, and it was just worth going and doing something in the UK before stepping into the German one, not least because when I got to Bremgarten, to sort of the end destination, the training group, the Ausbildungsgruppe, which operated on the base at Bremgarten, was bringing German pilots and weapon system operators up to speed with flying in Germany, but they had already learnt to fly the Phantom in America. So they did all their training there, and therefore, without any Phantom experience, I'd probably been struggling a little bit when I got down to Bremgarten. So I went off to Royal Air Force Lucas, which was where the Phantom Operational Conversion Unit was at the time, number 228 OCU, and I had a fantastic few weeks as part of a short course alongside a long course. So students who were coming straight out of the flying training system, you're just getting a bit of time in the airplane. And I flew 25 or so hours on with a mixture of pilots to get myself sort of converted and qualified to fly it, and then flew quite a lot of sources with navigators. And that was absolutely brilliant fun, because it was something I'd never done before. B, it was a taste of the air defense role, because that was the UK Phantom was an air defense airplane, not a reconnaissance airplane. So just getting a bit of insight into working with the radar and doing the kind of things that they did in the air defense role was absolutely brilliant fun to go and do, and was a tremendous value without a shadow of a doubt. And it set me up really well. So by the time we got to I guess the latter part at this stage of 1989, I was all set, and I arrived at Bremgarten with moved house down, sorted everything out to get there in September 1989. And all through that year, anybody that was around at the time will recall this. There was huge amounts of political turbulence with what was becoming an increasing stream of refugees out of the Warsaw Pact countries into the West, and particularly from East Germany into West Germany. And the writing was kind of on the wall for the end of the Warsaw Pact. And that had been something that had been going on really for months at that stage. But the catalyst was coming, and I got there just ahead of that. So I arrived in September, and actually in November of that year, the Berlin Wall came down. I can vividly remember we were night flying on the squadron at that stage. We'd gone into the bar for a beer after night flying, and I remember one of my colleagues on the squadron coming in, incredibly excited and just kind of overwhelmed in some ways with the fact that there were people sitting on top of the Berlin Wall. And for anyone who recalls that kind of chapter in history, I mean, this was a wall that had divided Berlin, but also was very symbolic of the division of Germany. And that was the beginning of the end of the divided Germany. And inevitably, it meant that reunification was now on the cards. And that was a really, really big thing for the German nation. They had always had this as a kind of number one point on their constitution, but I think most people never really considered it was going to happen. And suddenly it was now going to happen. And that dominated the rest of my tour in all sorts of unforeseen ways that, not least the television coverage. In those days, it was pre-satellite TV when we arrived. And so we were living with the German TV channels, and that was all we had. And they were completely dominated by reunification discussion. And no question, that was a overwhelming thing for West Germany in particular, who suddenly were looking at, how are we going to do this? How are we going to suddenly bring the two nations together, not least given the massive wealth and social economic structure differences between West Germany and East Germany. And the bill for that in financial terms, of course, was enormous. And so that was a huge, huge factor. It also generated some really interesting things as part of what I was doing on the squadron. And I'll come back to that when I get into it a little bit further. But we were, as I mentioned earlier, we were living in a German village, so that was a completely different construct. It was we had lovely neighbours, thankfully. We had the house that had been occupied by the exchange officer, British exchange officer, for some years, and several of my predecessors had been in the same house. So the neighbours that we had in the locality, who tended to be very static there, they lived there for years and years, were fabulous. They were really, really helpful and great at helping us to integrate into their little community, which was massively important because, unlike the kind of life I'd been used to at Bruggen and Laarbruck, the German sort of social life away from work was much, much less evident. It was really go to work, do the things you did in work, which was a bit of night flying, a bit more night flying than I'd been used to on the Jaguar, but a lot of day flying. And then when you're away from work, you were away from work, and you were, your local community was really important. And I guess the context for that is that an awful lot of the German military, not just in the Air Force, actually, in all of their services, they tend to go to bases where they have come from, if you like, and they've grown up in a place. And so a lot of my colleagues on the squadron were historically from Baden-Württemberg, and actually a lot of them from Freiburg and Bremgarten itself, and very much in that area. So a funny old thing that, when they went home, they were going exactly that. They were going home. They were going back to their local villages where they were well known, and they had their families for many, many years. So that was a very, very distinct difference between life working for the German Air Force and life working for the Royal Air Force, particularly in Germany. I mentioned the training group and the fact that obviously the German pilots and weapon system operators did their training in the States, and essentially the role of the training group was to Europeanize, if you like, the air crew going before they went onto a squadron. And there were several key elements of that. They'd been learning to fly the Phantom, and actually prior to that had done all of their flying training in the United States, and they'd mostly done that in places in the United States where the weather is great nearly all the time. So flying in Europe, where the weather is definitely not great all of the time, was a major change that they had to get used to pretty quickly. And the other big change was the fact they were doing a lot more stuff at low level, and it wasn't as low. We didn't fly at 250 feet. We flew at 500 feet with the Luftwaffe in Bremgarten. Anyway, we did fly lower when we went to other places where we were allowed to. So some of the time we were in the UK, for example, we were originally allowed to fly down to 250 feet. And we used to go over to Goose Bay in Canada once a year and go and do a detachment there where we'd work down to 100 feet. And so, again, very big difference when you're used to flying around at 500 feet to step down to 100 feet was a massive difference. But that training group was hugely important in terms of preparing young pilots and weapon system operators, but also people like me, actually, to get into the airplane and get used to what its capabilities were and how they operated. And of course, they had a whole range of different procedures that were totally different to the ones I'd been used to in the RAF. And then I moved to the squadron from the training group, and the squadron life was also very different. I was the only exchange officer on my squadron. There were two squadrons on the base. The other squadron actually had a Canadian pilot and also a Turkish crew, so a pilot and a weapon system operator. So they had three exchange officers on the second squadron. I was on the first squadron, and I was, as they lovingly called me, the Kriegsgefangene, the prisoner of war. um, who was part of the squadron. And right from the very beginning, they made my life, really very, very enjoyable on the squadron. One of the first questions was, what do you want to do? Do you want to speak English or do you want to speak German? And we spoke English in the air because everybody speaks English in the air. That's the international language that's used all the time. And so on the radio, I was always speaking English. But even in the airplane between the cockpits, talking to my Wizzo, I would be speaking German from the very beginning, and also on the squadron, right from the training group onwards. All of the time, I said, "Oh, no, I want to speak German because I'm not going to get better if I speak English." And they all spoke English, so it was easy for them, if you like, to, certainly in the working sense, to switch to English if we needed to. And the books and so on were in English because they were American books, because it was essentially an American airplane. But it was great to then get completely immersed in the language. The amusing thing was that, having done a 6-month language course, having effectively finished that language course with my wife at the time, who was the same standard as me, we were both had done the same things and were very much on a level playing field. And I, of course, was speaking on a squadron with the guys all the time. She was speaking all the time to people she was interacting with in the local village, and going shopping and doing all of the things that occupied her time. So actually our language grew in a completely different direction. And suddenly I'd come home and find that we had a whole set of spice jars that were all in German, and they were German words I'd never learnt because I didn't know all the different spices. And so we had a kind of difference and variation in the language, which was hugely amusing and a little bit challenging at the time as well. But pretty quickly, I think both of us got to the point where we were really, really comfortable in the language. And somebody said to me a long time ago that, you've cracked it when you're dreaming in the language. And that was, probably about 6 months in. I definitely found that was the case, and that was terrific, because you then felt you're really comfortable with what you're speaking and how you're operating, and that made life so much better. And the actual life on the squadron, the way we operated, was again very different to the RAF, but in some ways, it was not that different. We were still part of NATO. We were still doing we had the same standards and tactical requirements that we needed to meet for NATO. They did operate differently, though, in terms of process, and the amount of flying we did was slightly different. And I'd been very much advised before I went, just keep your head down, just do what they're asking you to do. Don't try and be too vocal or pushy, and so I didn't do that. I just basically waited and watched what they were going to do with me, and it was great because they did very quickly say, yeah, okay, we can really make some use of you. And I was once I was made combat ready, and I actually had some formation leading qualifications. I then got responsibility for training up some of the young pilots on the squadron and the Wizzos and in the back seat with me to get their skills up to where they needed to be as well. And the aeroplane itself was old and in many ways a bit primitive, but it was a delight to fly. It was just fantastic. It was huge performance, very, very powerful aeroplane, particularly at low level, where it's got engines that would drive it incredibly quickly. The fastest I've ever been at low level was in a Phantom out in Goose Bay, where at one point we were doing 800 knots at 200 feet. And that's extraordinarily quick. I mean, supersonic at low level. You really do get a sense of the ground rushing by, and that was just quite extraordinary. And obviously at a high level as well, it was very efficient, and it would go a lot higher, a lot more straightforwardly than anything that I'd flown previously. Certainly the Jaguar, which was not great at all at a high level. And we used to do quite a bit of advanced maneuvering with it and throw it around. Would go to Beja in Portugal once a year as well, and would actually fly there, predominantly doing basic fighter maneuvers, so effectively combat, but defensive combat. Because the one really fundamental difference between the German Phantom and anything I'd flown operationally previously was it's an unarmed airplane. It was the original alone, unarmed and unafraid reconnaissance, which we had a suite of cameras that were all internal to the airplane, not a pod as it was in the Jaguar. We had them all in the nose, with windows in the nose that looked out where the cameras pointed out. And the only pod we would fly with was when we were doing some very high level sideways looking airborne radar work, where we actually had a pod on the airplane that would look at significant distance and radar image things on the ground. And that was a completely different requirement to anything we were doing at low level. But the fact that it didn't have any weapons meant that your only defense was to basically be avoiding being seen, avoiding being found. So the low level role was hugely important from that point of view. It didn't help that we had J79 engines, American engines, which were incredibly smoky at low level. So they didn't help, and it was a much bigger aeroplane as well than the Jaguar. So in terms of camouflage and the like, it wasn't as easy to hide it. And so that's why we did the basic fighter maneuvering. We did some defensive maneuvering to try and be able to defeat other threats, and that was. When I look at it realistically these days, I think we were trying to convince ourselves that this was going to be okay, but the reality was, had we got to a really bad scrap, then I think we were dead meat really. But it was fun. It was great fun to be able to do it, and it was great fun to be able to throw the airplane around a bit because it was a very different airplane to fly, very different flying characteristics and than the Jaguar had. The low level we did was great as well. We did, as I say, lots in Germany, and we were in the southern bit of Germany, which has got more mountains and very different equipment, mainly American NATO force structure, whereas the Brits were in the north. The Americans were very much dominant in the south. And so we would go and do a lot of work with, just as we had done on 2 Squadron, flying over live kit all the time. And that was terrific fun. We'd also did quite a lot of flying in France because we were very adjacent to France, and would go and low fly over there. And that was again, lovely. And it just really showed and highlighted to me the low population density of France, which I think to this day that's still true, because you could fly vast distances in a straight line and actually not fly over any significant centres of population, which is certainly not true in the UK, where you could go almost no distance before you run into a town and have to go around it. So the actual role was a lot of fun, and the airplane was a lot of fun, and it was great to learn the language. And then, as I've already said, it was a terrific place to live. But it was a challenging environment, not least because of what I mentioned at the beginning. The whole reunification process was kicking off. That changed the dynamic unimaginably for everybody in Germany, I think, but particularly the military. One of the things that was very apparent at the time I went to Bremgarten was, whereas I have always been enormously proud of being in the Air Force and never afraid to talk to anyone about it, and to probably needing to be restrained from talking to people about it quite a lot of the time, there was nobody I worked with in those days and in the Luftwaffe who would go downtown Freiburg and tell people that they were in the military, because it just wasn't something that they were particularly proud of. They have, I think, changed significantly over the last 30 or so years, where that really has made a big difference to them in terms of the view of their own armed forces. But of course, this was a lot of legacy Second World War, where actually being in the military was just generally not considered a great thing to do, and it was definitely difficult for the people I worked with, and I felt for them for that. It was hard, and there was pressure too, because immediately the Warsaw Pact started crumbling. Then, just as with every military, including the UK, I mean, the UK military changed shape dramatically in the years following the end of the Cold War. The Germans did that very quickly as well, and they looked at, right, what are our requirements now in terms of how we're going to operate? And they changed, for example, their low flying system. They said, okay, we don't think we've got much of a threat anymore, so we're going to go to 1,000 feet instead of doing low flying at 500 feet. Now, for anyone that's ever done any flying, the difference between 500 feet and 1,000 feet is enormous. I mean, it's not low flying anymore. It's basically, you can straight line everywhere. You don't have to worry very much about obstacles unless they're really significant, obstacles like masts and so on. It's not the same challenge at all. And the Germans actually were quite surprised at a sort of a system level that very quickly after they said, okay, we're shutting our low flying system, everyone has to fly at 1,000 feet in Germany, and that included the Brits and the Americans and everybody else that was flying there. That funny old thing, the French, who had allowed us to fly down to 500 feet everywhere, and the Brits, who'd allowed us to fly down as low as 250 feet when we'd gone over to the UK, suddenly said, well, great, you can come here in your Luftwaffe aeroplane, but you're going to fly at 1,000 feet because that's what you make us do. So it meant that the role and the ability to do the job as properly, if you like, was starting to get a bit constrained. Then politics intervened even further because, as if it wasn't enough to have the reunification issues bubbling along, and there were lots of things that were happening with that. There was also the Gulf War that came in 1990 and generated a significant challenge, constitutional challenge for the German military and the German government generally, because they had, although they were in NATO, and obviously they clearly signed up to everything that was NATO in terms of the common security policy, etc. There was definitely a real challenge around, and an instinctive belief that was because in the Cold War, the threat, that Germany was the front line of the threat, and therefore they were going to be defending Germany from a Warsaw Pact invasion. Suddenly, that wasn't going to happen anymore, and they're now looking at these much more far-reaching type roles that NATO was starting to get into. Not least what was happening in Kuwait and the coalition that was being built around that, which essentially had a NATO feel to it, even though it wasn't per se a NATO operation. And it generated a big problem for the Luftwaffe and for the wider German armed forces, because they really didn't see that as being their role, and I think it caused them a lot of grief in terms of mental mindset as to how do we fit into this, and also how are we going to prepare? What are we going to do? So that was another challenge that I could probably talk for much longer about, which was really hard for them. Added to all of that was, as the reunification thing gathered pace, then one of the things that happened very quickly was that the former East German military was largely collapsed and shut down, and they kept a few things in the West. So they kept the Airbuses that they had for transport aircraft that were in the NVA, the former East German Air Force. And they also kept their MiG-29s, which were the best fighters that they'd had there, and were also technology that was very much new and novel, and we viewed as a significant threat. So it was interesting to now have some of them on our side, as it were, and be operating with them. And what they then did was started to bring those members of the former East German military that were still active, so particularly those Fulcrum pilots, in the case of the example I'll use here, they were coming over to West German, as it was, airfields and learning about what it was like to be in the West and as part of the Western military. So that was really fascinating, because we would have quite regularly, one or two former NVA pilots who would be with us for a week or so and would chat to us. Effectively, we were, if you like, indoctrinating them into the West and getting them used to the procedures and processes and everything else that we had. But it also was an opportunity for us to turn around and get a better understanding of what life had been like for them in the East and in the Warsaw Pact time. And we had obviously had a huge amount of, I guess, assumptions around what it was going to look like, to what the threat was like, how much ammunition they had, all those sorts of things. We know how realistic was it that they were going to come across the border, what kind of limitations did they operate under, and there were all sorts of things that we were able to glean from those conversations that were just fascinating to see. Right, okay, we were mostly right. They did have a lot of ammunition. They did have a lot of intent. They also were incredibly restrictive about what they allowed their pilots to do, how much fuel they allowed them to have in the airplane, what kind of radio capability they had. So they didn't have the ability to just dial up manual frequencies and therefore effectively easily defect to the West. And so all these sorts of things were really fascinating elements that we were able to get under the skin of. Very, very frustratingly on a personal level, I wasn't able to go and fly into the former East, where obviously a lot of my colleagues on the squadron were able to do that because they were German nationals. The 2+4 agreement that had been signed as the reunification document, if you like, to unify Germany and make it an independent sovereign state as one nation, specifically exempted exchange officers from being able to do that. So I was sitting there watching my colleagues go and fly to places that I had studied exhaustively, and not least when I was doing the nuclear role. And I would love to have gone and had a look and gone and flown in and had a chance to tour around, but sadly I wasn't able to go and do that. But it meant that the challenge as the tour progressed, became quite difficult for me personally as well. I mean, I think, we'd lost low flying. We're now much more limited in what we could do. We were getting quite constrained in all sorts of other areas of what we were able to go and do because of the politics around reunification and so on and so forth. So actually, when I got to the end of my time and I left at the very end of 1991, having done 2.25 years, I guess, I was really quite ready to return to the UK. And as it was, I'd been promoted. I'd become a squadron leader, which was fabulous. That I'd kind of ticked all the boxes to get promoted before I'd gone to exchange, and then the promotion happened while I was there, which was lovely. So I was then going back to the UK to be a flight commander as a squadron leader on a UK Jaguar squadron at Coltishall, and that was taking me back where I'd kind of intended to go. If I hadn't gone on exchange in the first place, and at a senior rank where obviously I was then progressing up the career ladder. So that was really lovely, and the timing couldn't have been better because it was just optimal for me to be able to go at that stage. And of course, it was the end of 8 years for me in Germany. I was there almost 8 years from April '84 to the end of very end of '91. So I was only a few months short of a full 8 years, during which the world had changed. I mean, I'd arrived, and the Cold War was still a real thing. If you've listened to some of the earlier personal stories ones, you'll know me talking about going and visiting the inner German border and the very, very real nature of the threat and the way we trained and exercised and prepared for everything that was going on. And now I was leaving, with Germany reunifying and progressively reunifying, the Warsaw Pact having disappeared completely as a threat, NATO now already starting to refocus and look at doing other things, the Gulf War having happened, and stuff already going on in terms of the aftermath of the Gulf War that I'll talk about on a different podcast. So the scale and scope of that change took some getting used to. I mean, it was a really challenging sort of bit of headspace for me to think about, wow, in a relatively short space of time, the whole world has kind of changed in ways I don't think anyone could have foreseen when I'd first arrived in Germany in 1984. But I was ready to go home, that's for sure. And I'd loved it. I'd had a great time. The exchange tour was definitely a good time. I look back to where I started here, fork in the road. Could I have gone to the QY course and been a weapons instructor and then gone and done all the things that were there? Sure, I could have done that, and I didn't. But I went down the exchange tour route, and I hope I've shed a bit of light on what that was like. I could do probably a whole series of podcasts on this, on their own. And if there's appetite for that, please let me know. But I do think it was special to be able to go and learn another language, live with another culture. It's only really when you do that, and having done it, that I really appreciate, how much you gain from going and being completely immersed in the way that we were living in a village, and we were just lucky it happened to be in a really lovely part of Germany as well. So that was an absolute plus. But when it came to an end, it was time to go home, and so that is the next chapter that'll be on the personal stories front. I've probably got some more guests I'm going to bring in the intervening weeks before you get to that. But I really hope these are still enjoyable and interesting for you. Please do continue to give me some feedback. That's always very, very helpful. I'm going to try, as I mentioned in the last couple of podcasts, to do a few different things in this season of what we're doing for the podcast, and I really hope it continues to be useful and interesting. This has been very much a story as opposed to any top tips and leadership insights, but from a very, very interesting time in world politics and so on that I think was fascinating. So I hope you've enjoyed it. All the very best. Speak to you very soon. Bye-bye for now.